Hello and welcome. This is a From Day One webinar entitled Building an Effective, Compassionate Employee Relief Program. Please welcome From Day One co-founder and Chief Content Officer, Steve Koepp.
Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar. I'd like to thank you in advance for attending and participating in today's event. We'll be exploring the topic of building an effective, compassionate employee relief program. As the current health and social crisis has affirmed, it's more important than ever for companies to have a vital support system for their employees who are affected by disaster or personal hardship. We're going to learn more about programs providing grants to employees for basic life necessities, including food, medical expenses, and housing through the COVID-19 crisis and beyond. We'd like to thank our sponsor today, E4E Relief. For 20 years, E4E Relief has been the leading provider of charitable employee relief funds, rapidly responding to natural disaster and human hardships on behalf of employers. As an independent third-party public charity, E4E Relief empowers global companies and employees to provide and receive meaningful financial relief when it's needed most, creating a strong sense of engagement and community. E4E Relief's roots as a subsidiary of Foundation for the Carolinas, one of the largest community foundations in the US, led them to best practice grant making and industry expertise. In the last 5 years, E4E Relief has awarded more than $105 million in charitable grants, supporting relief efforts for 4 million people worldwide. Now I'd just like to mention a few logistical items before we launch our conversation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event using your registration email. You can watch for a written account of the conversation next week on our website, which is fromday1.co. At 2:45 Eastern Time, we'll have a Q&A session. So please start submitting your questions whenever you'd like using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, the business journalist Lydia Dishman, who reports and edits for Fast Company on tech and leadership issues, and has written for CBS Money Watch, Fortune, and the New York Times, among others. Now over to you, Lydia.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you for allowing me to host another conversation that is so timely and important. But before we get into it, I would like to take a moment to recognize George Floyd and his family and the victims of other violence perpetrated on racial injustice and inequality. So if we could just take a moment to bow our heads and remember those who have gone before and those families who are making sacrifices to promote social justice. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm sure that in a small way, our good thoughts will somehow help those who have heavy hearts. So to start off, I'd like Holly and Lynette to introduce themselves and tell us briefly about their role in their respective organizations. Lynette, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you so much, Lydia. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lynette Bell, president of the Truist Foundation. I have been at Historic SunTrust for over 30 years in multiple roles in the institution. I've done everything but make a loan. My current role is managing our foundation, and we have an endowed foundation at Truist, and we launched it this year after the merger of SunTrust and BB&T, which closed in December of 2019. And my team and I have been on the ground running, doing that, knowing that there's opportunity for us to invest in a very intentional way across this country. And so we're excited about what we've been doing, but my background has been in risk, compliance, internal control, operations, retail, you name it. I've done a lot of jobs based on my long tenure with the company. Thank you.
That's kind of amazing. You don't often hear people stay with one organization for as long as that, but given that you've worn very many hats, Renaissance woman right here.
That's right.
Holly, how about you? Tell us a little bit about your role in your organization.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I serve as CEO of E4E Relief, but I too have a long history with Foundation for the Carolinas. I'm 22 years at Foundation for the Carolinas and E4E Relief, and have been in a variety of roles there in the sector, and have really enjoyed being in and around the world of social impact and philanthropy in my career. I started out as an attorney, but decided to take the path of using that law degree in this way, and it's been really wonderful.
Well, for those in the audience who may not know what an employee relief program is, why don't you both share a little bit about what the definition is in your organization and how your organization is using employee relief programs? Lynette, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. Again, I say that Truist Financial Corporation merged in December. One of the things that we wanted to ensure that we provided was access for teammates to, and so we got 58,000 employees at Truist, and we called those employees teammates to garner that nice brotherhood and sisterhood of support. But one of the things that we wanted to provide was grants that affected catastrophic disasters, natural disasters, and even other natural or man-made disasters related to violence, domestic violence, deaths of a spouse or partner, catastrophes, job furloughs that happen to your partners, particularly around COVID, as we look at that right now. And so one of the things was to make sure that we took care of our employees, because that was really important for us. You know, our mission at Truist is to inspire and build better lives and communities. That applies to those 58,000 employees that we want to ensure that they have the opportunity to thrive. And things happen to us as we live every day, and we wanted to make sure that we put the right system in place to support that workforce, because they bring 100, 120% every day. And we wanted to make sure that when those catastrophic or unexpected things happen in life, that this organization is there to support them.
We think of employee relief at E4E Relief as simply a company-sponsored charitable program that provides grants to employees in crisis to pay for basic life necessities. And it's based really on current IRS or tax laws. And we typically think of those grants to individuals as supporting catastrophic or other natural disasters, personal hardships like house fires, or personal financial or other hardships like domestic violence situations, or other, maybe your family is ill, something like that. We believe employee relief, which is kind of a relatively new phenomenon and in greater need today, represents a fundamental shift or change in the way people think about the relationship between the company and its employees. Our goal at E4E Relief is to unite the company and its employees in compassion to create a way for meaningful relief in times of hardship. And the timing of our webinar is, you know, so well placed, because there's so many companies that have demonstrated that relationship in COVID-19. It's been pretty incredible to sit in this position and watch the outpouring of support from corporate America to really their greatest asset, which is their people.
Absolutely. And now adding a layer, I just kind of wanted to get a little bit of clarity from both of you. The looting and destruction that's happened over the last few days during the protests over the killing of George Floyd did disrupt a lot of businesses and may have affected the livelihood of the employees of those businesses. So would employee relief be something that would be used in a case like this as well?
Yes, I think so. There's several ways it can be used. Lynette, I don't know if you want to talk about that for your shop, but I can talk about what we're doing, and then maybe you can play off of that if you'd like. Does that make sense for you? You know, typical expenses that we might support would be medical or funeral expenses, short-term medical issues, unscheduled or temporary loss of job or income because of this, crime, you know, impacts of crime, whether that be medical or other, repairs to vehicles or residences that might be damaged as a result. And we're relying on thinking of this as in many instances, a catastrophic disaster with military action. I mean, that we do actually have some military action happening in our communities. And so those would be examples of expenses that we would believe would be legitimate in these kinds of situations happening around the U.S.
Yeah, Holly, you make a very good point. At Truist, we really believe that this One Team Fund, which is supported by those teammates, should be used for those unexpected events that happen in life. And so loss of wages, loss of jobs, damage to property, whether disaster or man-made, are also supported by that One Team Fund. So it really is that critical gap filler for grant funding to support them based on whatever event has happened in life that has a necessity for a financial need based on hardship. And so, yeah, we definitely would support our employees in this critical time.
And Lydia, to some extent, the answer to this question is dependent upon the company's program and their approach. Every company is going to have a different approach, and they might say, I really want to support people in mass catastrophic disasters, only, or I want to support only personal hardships. Mm-hmm. Some want to support everything. Truist is one of those companies that supports both. So that allows for a more broad interpretation of how we might support people for these unexpected events.
Well, let's take a step back for a moment, if you will, Holly, and tell us about how the concept of such employee relief funds emerged and how your organization got started.
Sure. The concept of employee relief is not new. We got started many years ago with 9/11, and it's very interesting to be having been at the foundation working on that 9/11 work and now working on COVID, and seeing some linkages and some departures. I would say COVID is almost like all the things rolled into one, as you noted, earlier before we started. I mean, it's catastrophic disaster and personal hardship in the most direct way. But, I think one of the things, while it's not new, I think what's different about lately is that the mechanisms for structure, the legal pieces, the IT pieces, the data privacy pieces that are so important have really more recently been formed and created and improved upon. And that has allowed for companies to decide whether they wanted to develop that infrastructure themselves or whether they wanted to outsource that to a partner that was sort of solely focused in this area. And one of the reasons Foundation for the Carolinas spun this off was because it really is very different business than a community foundation's work every day. And so really honing in and developing a specific set of business credentials around this. When you're serving corporate America and you're in a B2B essentially environment, there's a certain level of expectation about what you have in terms of infrastructure, support, and expertise on your team. And so we were committed very early on to essentially creating a mantra around compassion, readiness, and excellence. And that is really how we've built the business, so to speak, the last several years, with key factors in terms of trying to treat people well because they are in a most difficult moment, maybe in some cases in their lives. And so having people on the phone that are trained and ready to have those conversations and having compassion and walking people through something that might seem very simple to do in a normal environment that's very difficult when you're that anxious or that you're in harm's way. And so our commitment was to take what in essence had been developed in the foundation field, which is a set of best practices and excellence around grant making to organizations, and turn that into a set of best practices around grant making to individuals. And I think that grant making to individuals piece is the part that's really evolved in the last several years. And if you look at, climate change, constant weather events, constant hardships, you begin to see and come out of the trend analysis and relief by saying that we believe that employee relief is part of the social safety net now that is necessary to support those critical workers in your business today. There are certain industries that feel COVID, for example, far worse than others. And so having something in place that where we're not going through the process of walking down the road together in the middle of a crisis, but rather it's already done and we're already walking down that road, allows for a smoother, more seamless response to provide that social safety net for your employees.
Well, it's interesting that you said about seamless. You know, Lynette, you told us that the merger of the two banks happened in December, which seems like a century ago, given all the events of the last few months. But I wonder if you could talk about integrating the charitable aspects of each of the companies, and how you had to just make that shift, that pivot to help people that were impacted by COVID.
Yeah, it's a really great question and an interesting time for all of us here at Truist. We merged in December 5th. I remember the date. It felt like when we announced the merger, I put my skates on and started running. Because in my other function, we were supporting listening sessions and meeting with the Federal Reserve and FDIC, because part of my job was regulatory related. And so we were really heavily involved in the process. The merger closed and we were so excited, and I got the new opportunity to lead the 6th largest banks foundation, which was for Truist. And so the good news is that both banks, BB&T and SunTrust, were firm investors in our communities. They really believe that mantra that if you build communities, you build your bank. And so they invested in that. And so it was about merging concepts of investing of those two entities, and we did that. The other piece was that we had to set up integrated systems. And so you can imagine, based on our size, that we have thousands of platforms and systems and processes that, wow, have to be wickered together. And we're not through wickering. We're still in that integration of systems and applications. And so we stood up the foundation really quickly in March. We launched our foundation. A week later, the pandemic happened. And we had to pivot right away. We were like, what? We got to pivot. There's something going on. I would say leaders, our CEO, Kelly King, was really adamant that we need to get in front of the pandemic. And that's what we've done, was got in front of it. And so we looked at building these foundation with these pillars and strategic direction. And for the foundation, we were like, we hosted listening sessions during the merger, and we got all of this feedback of things that happened from Pennsylvania down to Miami, Florida. And we came up with, we thought, 4 defined pillars for the foundation. And the first one was leadership development, because BB&T had a strong history of providing leadership to nonprofits and communities organizations. When we had the listening sessions, we heard in every city, whether small, large, or rural or urban, that economic mobility was a clear component of needs in communities. And so that was the second pillar that we thought, let's start attacking and having some difference in that particular arena. Third was around thriving communities. And we left this very broad for a real number of reasons, but we thought that, wow, as you go from one community to another, needs are drastically different. The needs of Macon, Georgia are going to be different from the needs in Baltimore, Maryland. And so allowing those communities and community-based organizations and nonprofits who have their thumb on the pulse of what's happening in the marketplace to help drive some of our investments, we thought was critical. And the final one was education. And that's everything you can think about education, from early childhood development to seniors. And so we were so excited. We had our 4 pillars ready to go. The pandemic happened and really rocked our world in a way that we pivoted to say, what should we cover for this pandemic? We looked around to figure out, how do we assess the right data to make this informed decision? So we started working with national partners like the CDC Foundation in Atlanta, Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. But even more importantly, United Way, which was one of our national partners, kept giving us data on 211 was having these huge surges in their call centers as the pandemic reached and marched around the country. And they were sending us reports and data. And so when we saw what was happening, we wanted to make sure we provided basic needs in a comprehensive and quick and responsive manner. So we announced Truist Cares as part of addressing the pandemic. On March 18th, 22 days later, we had deployed our first $25 million. So we had to pivot for that. And we had 5 focus areas. We focused on youth, on seniors. And for seniors, we were like, what do they need? Like food security and medical supplies. We looked at small businesses, workforce, and then we said, like, how do we keep people connected? Because what we knew from some of the national partners was that they kept saying, this is going to have a long tail in the US. And with that long tail, business models had to change, as well as nonprofit models had to change. We all had to shelter in place, which we're doing today, shuttering in place, but having connectivity. So we thought, how do we help organizations build connectivity that create a new business model? So yeah, we have our pillars for the foundation, which we just launched a week before the pandemic happened, but we pivoted really quickly to address those basic needs in a consistent and concise manner and in a rapid manner to respond to. One of the things I will say, even under Truist Cares for the pandemic, we included our teammates, our employees. So for the One Team Fund, which E4E manages for us, and I won't, they are the best organization to have to help develop that program because they provide the consistency, the autonomy needed to make those decisions. But E4E, we made, for every employee that donated $1, the foundation, the Truist Foundation, made a committed donation of $4 for every $1 that an employee donated. So we thought about our employees even in that instance during COVID-19.
Yeah, better than a one-for-one match.
Yes,
if you're
exactly
doing
right.
4-to-1. So obviously there are partnerships, but what I want to do is, it's a two-part question. And the first part of it is about the internal gears that make it work. And I wanted to ask you both about, I mean, obviously these events are unprecedented. Everybody had to be in reactive mode rather than proactive mode. So when you're working across teams within your organizations, how did you come together and, for lack of a better way of saying this, get buy-in from a bunch of different people that really weren't actually used to working together before? How do you make that collaboration happen? So Holly, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. You know, by the nature of serving all of these companies all over the country, we end up in situations where these mergers are happening a lot, and maybe not a lot, but you know, enough to notice for us. And so some instances we have a relationship with the legacy company and the new firm is coming in. Sometimes it's with the new firm and sometimes it's with neither. But this idea of cross-functional, cross-departmental collaboration at the company, you can get a really, really clear sense of culture by entering into these discussions, you know, with a relief program, because you're kind of, there's something about the employees, the charitable, the way it's run, the IT components. It sort of brings all of these things together across many disciplines. And if you're talking about a big firm, you're talking about a significant amount of process to navigate and some wet noodles to move around and some other things. And so you can always tell when you have a good partner, you know, straight out of the gate. And I think we've gotten some expertise in trying to navigate, you know, the companies and move this through and work collaboratively. I think we've gotten smarter about asking the right questions up front and knowing who to bring to the table earlier rather than later. So if the company doesn't have a particular set of folks at the table, the question is asked, well, how about having them at the table? Should we have them at the table? Mm-hmm. I think when we first started, we were afraid to do that, to be honest, because we're just the charity, and you know how that can be. But it's really important that we get the right players early on, or it drags on forever and it doesn't go where it needs to go. And so the internal gear piece of this is really, really important in a relief program, because in essence, the best ones that are run in this country, and this is mostly a US-based phenomenon at this point, the best ones are those that are collaboratively run with a clear leader, you know, in place. So a decision maker, but a collaborative relationship. I feel Truist's situation was just that. I mean, our conversations with the firm, we had an existing relationship with SunTrust. We were already talking to BB&T, but of course, when those things come together, all bets are off, and you kind of have to start over again and make your case and say, this is why this new company should care about this issue, and this is how we operate.
Matt?
Yeah, I would say that Holly makes a very valid point. Getting the right decision makers at the table is important. I would say because of the merger, we felt like we were already collaborating quite a bit and reaching across the aisle, so to speak. But when we think about the one team fund of providing that employee relief, I think Holly said it best earlier, the social safety net needed, E4E exhibited that they were the right organization for us, that they had a very streamlined and seamless process, so it feels easy to the end user. And we thought, wow, we don't need to recreate the wheel on that, because there were so many other things going on. And why do that when we have a partner in place with a proven track record and history to actually execute on a relief fund for your employees? And so they have provided us with great insight, great advice on what to do. And as Holly said, bringing the other components to the table, even as we had some authority to make the decision as a foundation, but where's HR, where's human resources, where's some other components of it as we talk about this? And so she was very instrumental in helping us build this out as a company. So we can't even put a value on that type of great advice and support and professionalism.
I just want to take a moment to invite Steve back to do a little station identification. We're almost at the half hour here.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to remind anyone joining our webinar in midstream that we're from day one. We're exploring how to build an effective, compassionate employee relief program in these trying times. Our sponsor is E4E Relief. We'll be doing a Q&A session soon, and you can submit your questions right now or anytime in the next half hour using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Holly and Lynette are glad to answer your questions. Now back to you, Lydia.
Thank you. So while we're talking about logistics in a certain way, how do both relief agencies and companies deal with situations that call for greater financial resources? Again, we are dealing with unprecedented times, and if we're looking ahead, not to be doom and gloom, but hurricane season is coming, and we've already heard about several that have come. So what do you do about those extra financial resources?
Yeah, I will say that once we launched the One Team Fund, within a week of launching that, we had tornadoes in Tennessee. And one of the things that we did, so we have the opportunity internally, and this is a teammate-driven fund supported by our foundation, is that once the tornadoes hit, we provided news stories through different channels inside of the organization so that everyone was aware of the fund and how it could support in the case of a natural disaster, catastrophic event, or how comprehensive our plan was to be supportive of them. We had employees really rally at that point in time, and so they invested into the fund, and we've raised from just our employee giving alone, they provide about $370,000 into our One Team Fund. And guess what? That was during the time of our 4-to-1 match, and so we put an additional $1.3 million into that One Team Fund. But when you see the critical need that happens during a disaster with the tornadoes, and that property was damaged and employees lost homes, and just their ability to continue to have their everyday lives go concert to what they are accustomed to, those employees really rallied and did that. I will say we also assigned those executive sponsors on our leadership team to help support that. And they've been very good about making sure they provide the level of communication and engagement so that others see that we're leading from the top down, and they've made investments as well. And so we're going to have campaigns at the end of the year and rely on Holly and her team to give us some other advice of other best practices larger companies have done to actually continue to have that great boost into that fund. But employees are utilizing the fund. I will say with the advent of COVID-19, we've had teammates use the fund, and they've gotten about $400,000 been dispensed to those employees. It was a real spike in it because of COVID, and I would say 82% of our applications that came through the One Team Fund were COVID related, because guess what? Spouses or partners got furloughed. It was about food security. One of the great stories that was told the first week of us unveiling the Truist Cares initiative for COVID, an employee's husband got laid off right away, and their mortgage payment was due. And sad that people, because of expenses, have to live a certain way. But they applied. Within 5 business days, they got a check from our One Team Fund to cover their mortgage payment. So they were so happy that the company thought enough to incorporate in the pandemic response to think about their employees so that they could also get the benefit, right, of any interruption in their income or their lifestyle. And so we were able to do that, and E4E was responsive. They applied, it felt easy and seamless to them, and they got their money in 5 days later and paid their mortgage.
So Lydia, to go to the bigger financial question, first that you were asking, I think companies are really trying to determine among all the benefits and charitable programs that they offer, how best to support their employees, customers, and communities. If you hear Lynette and you hear her talk about her approach to COVID and how they interviewed, various cities up and down the East Coast to try to determine the need and came out the other side of that feeling a little bit differently than their original pillars. I would say that many of the companies themselves are feeling more stretched with their dollars than in a normal environment. And of course, the financial hardships themselves that the employees face are not, they're deeper. They're not normal hardships. They're, as she said, they're going to have a long tail. And so I think while companies are wrestling with their own revenue and their own financial challenges, and many of them have greater expense, far greater expense in this environment. If you look at healthcare and what the hospitals and other industries have had to do, you see examples in the restaurant industry that we've seen them where people are so challenged with the current environment that the relief program may have to take a back seat to the actual financial problem facing the company straight ahead of them. And yet you still see the firm trying to find a way to fund this in conjunction with all of the other things that they're trying to do for the employees, because it fits a certain segment that you just don't get in any other way. And so, but we've really seen companies and industry struggle with this the last several months. And, as far as hurricane season goes, couple thoughts there. One is, the predictions are that it's going to be a very active season with 4 major hurricanes this year. They're predicting 16 named storms, 8 hurricanes, and 4 of those to be major hurricanes. And that gives you a 69% chance that a major hurricane will hit the U.S. coastline. For E4E, because we are a global grant maker, what we're seeing is, if you take the U.S. view out of it, there are constant typhoons, earthquakes, and other major disasters in other parts of the world. So what we're finding with employee relief is that it's less seasonal than it used to be, and hurricane season itself, and I would also recognize wildfire season, which happens at the same time and is very detrimental to the Northwest, has previously driven our business, and it certainly is still going to be a driver of our work. But I would say that as these companies expand their programs to look internationally, that will change over time.
I'm curious about how this all plays into benefits, because it's my understanding, based on what you're saying, that these grants are unlike other benefits. So there are specific advantages for both the employer and the workers who are applying for them. One is that they're tax-free. Is that correct? And can you tell us a little bit more about that, Lynette?
Yeah, so these are, as I said, they're grants and they're tax-free. And so they're funded out of our One Team Fund, with E4E as the third-party vendor to support it. And employees have the ability to come in and get funding as needed without worrying about that. So yes, exactly that. It's
While we don't think of them as truly part of an employee benefit package, because that's not where they sit from a legal standpoint, I certainly think that companies stack them up as a benefit to the individual and think of them in totality as to the full offering of what an employee has access to. But the legal distinctions are, of course, that the charity is making the decision and that there's no right to aid. So it's a slightly different interpretation. But the gist of it is that the contributions in are tax deductible, and the grant awards out are not included in the taxable income to the recipient. And so what you're creating there, hopefully, if it's run well, is a virtuous cycle where programs are funded in large part by employees themselves to help their fellow employees and their peers. And then the grants are awarded to those same employees in a charitable way with sort of the best tax impacts possible.
Mhm.
Can you tell us all a little bit more about the application and selection process? I mean, obviously, you know, especially with COVID, a lot of people were probably coming forward and saying that they were impacted by this in a variety of different ways. So how do you vet those applications? Who's accountable for making sure that those funds are distributed equitably?
Nat, do you want me to take that one? Do you want to take
Yeah,
it?
I was going to say, Holly, you can go first on this and I'll chime in after you.
Okay. E4E works with a company to design the program that meets their needs, and then we create an application that matches up to the desire of what the company wants to fund or wants to be involved in funding. That process is very much the set of questions, and the rubric that we've created is designed around the Internal Revenue Code, you know, primarily 3833, but also Section 139. And we're looking for a demonstration of certain kinds of needs, and we're also in many instances checking resource and income tests to make sure that we are awarding grants in a manner that's consistent with the Internal Revenue Code's expectations. So that process and application is built technologically. The idea was, we thought, and this is sort of what I was talking about earlier about evolving grant making to individuals and really creating the infrastructure, you know, in devices like this, where if you're standing in 4 feet of water, you have the ability to apply in your program through a mobile first application and run through that process as efficiently as makes sense. I think one of the things that I would tell you about this business, having been in it now a while, is there is a balance between quality and efficiency all the time that is constantly pushed. You know, you might have a company that wants you to move fast, 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 but on the back end of it, they sure don't want the risk associated with the vetting process not being appropriate. And so it is a real dance to navigate various C-suites and leadership who might want to move. Maybe there's been a plant that got entirely wiped out by a hurricane and they want to do something now. You know, and so it's that will be the shtick with this type of charitable program, is the balance between these two things. And I think companies that put leadership like Lynette in place that understand that balance, and they understand that you have to have both things at the same time, those are the best people to work with, because they, you know, they understand that whenever you're dealing with many human beings and there are problems associated with those folks, it's not always going to be a smooth process. There are going to be things you have to work through together. And so understanding that balance, I think, is really important.
Lydia, I would add that the resource of E4E providing that level of streamlined capabilities so that I don't have to be engaged in the process of reviewing applications based on something judgmental in my book. The fact that they created a rubrics and actually we are removed from the process. Yes, we are in compliance with IRS restrictions, but based on our conversations with them when we start setting up this one team fund, they clearly understood our values as a company and integrated those into this comprehensive relief fund for employees. But I don't need to be personally involved in Jane Smith applying for a transaction. That really needs to be held in this third-party responsibility. And it gives us a freedom to know that they are providing a fair assessment and evaluation and making sure that the guidelines we set in place with them around the restrictions of IRS rules are being complied with, and we don't have to worry about that because they have the authority to do so and have demonstrated the capability to ensure that we are on the right side of the law, but also still supporting our employees based on the value systems that our company put in place.
Great, thank you both for that very thorough response. I want to be mindful of the time here. We have about 20 minutes left and we're getting a lot of questions. So I want to try to get to as many of those as possible. The first one is from Ruby, who says, what is your advice on first year and beyond benchmarks in terms of number of employees, the percentage of employees for natural disaster and personal hardship respectively? Any advice on benchmarking in general? So either or both of you can take that.
I would say for the first year for our One Team Fund, we did not technically set a benchmark for the program. And the reason for that was we just merged these two firms together and it was difficult to say that, but we know we doubled the capacity of employees. So we had a clue that, okay, we know disasters are coming and using some of that informed decision-making about what the expectation for the fund. So we knew we would set up campaigns periodically during the year to try to drive toward a specific goal, but we didn't put the goal out there for employees to say, hey, we're trying to get to $500,000. We just wanted them to give based on the values and the stories that we told, because we believe in kind of diving to story mining to talk about it, of how the fund has helped employees and how we can help each other. And so that is part of our value proposition that we had as a company. So we did set that for the first year. And I'm kind of glad we didn't, because they've exceeded our expectation in their giving pursuit.
Yeah, I would echo kind of the approach there and just say that everything that happens with these benchmarks is entirely driven by how the program is set up and communicated, marketed to the employee base. If the employee base understands that it exists and that and what makes it qualify, they're going to use the program and it's going to be understood. If it's communicated less frequently up front, or if, you know, it typically the first year benchmarks, the first 3 years, I would say. That's the way we look at it, as a 3-year build to both building the balance and the knowledge around fundraising for the company, as well as the use of the firm, of the fund. And so communications, marketing, and fundraising, I think the best programs in terms of utilization are probably those that do fundraise. We have several companies that we work with that do not fundraise for their programs. They are funding it from either a corporate line item or from their foundation, and they don't want to ask employees for gifts for whatever reason. There's a variety of reasons. It might be related to their already existing campaigns. They don't want to mix the two together. It might be that they feel they want to support the employees and they don't want to ask for any additional contributions for, you know, just out of some sort of cultural overlay. But the company programs that are known the best are ones that run fundraising campaigns and they tell the story of the individual person. And they put, you know, Mr. Smith, up on video, and they show what happened in the Tennessee tornadoes to Mr. Smith and how we were able to help him or her. And so there's some best practices, I think, around program design and setup that we typically try to put in place. Going as far as providing some fundraising counsel or philanthropic counsel in the setup of those programs to try to ensure that the initial piece of it, which is really important. How does it get rolled out initially? And what do people think about it? Did it get branded and named? Did it have, kind of its own life? And then what is the ongoing mechanism to run it internally and to talk about what's happening with it?
That's kind of partly part of Kim Watson's question. She said, what approach do you suggest for a smaller, locally based nonprofit to start an employee relief fund? Where can I review best practices? So if you could just expand a little bit on best practices, I think that would be helpful.
Sure. I think the first order of business around deciding you want to run relief programs is really familiarizing yourself with the Internal Revenue Code, what the requirements are, and then looking at and trying to decide what systems and support functions do you have in place to do that. I know when 9/11 was around and we were all beginning this process of employee relief, we were running it by committees. Everybody had a committee, and we occasionally, even during COVID, get calls, I want to talk about my committee. And the thing is that committees are a great way as an initial mechanism to draw, particularly as a nonprofit, on resources in the community in health and human services. Those are that are used to managing case management and social work are fantastic people to sit on these committees. And we actually had one of those committees early on. Obviously, what you find with relief programs is if you begin to offer them, you run into, again, this idea of volume, and committees don't go together. So you hit it if you're going to maintain a certain band of opportunity for your relief programs. You can run them by committee, and they run really well. And you could probably run a paper-based application process even, and it's great. But if you get into volume and start offering the service more broadly, then that's when the IT components and the business components really get tested. And you have to take this knowledge you've built around the Internal Revenue Code and the application of that and put it into a definable business process and rubric that you can use over and over again.
This is another somewhat related question from Lauren. It says, I'm not very clear how employers partner with either E4E or Truist, and Truist is partnering with E4E. So let's just kind of clear that up for Lauren and how people partner with E4E.
Sure. So E4E Relief partners with companies through fund agreements or contractual relationships where you are asking us, just like you might in a normal grant making context, we have agreements with every company saying what service, what your program is going to look like and what we're going to do. So it's simply, a charitable partner / service arrangement where you're hiring us essentially as a third-party manager of your program as a charity to manage the end-to-end process, intake, review, and outflow.
Lynette, you may be able to answer this one. Teresa says she believes that you said it needs to be a nonprofit entity. Is that at E4E or at the organization? And if so, does E4E set that up for you?
So when we partnered with E4E, we chose them as our third-party vendor to manage our One Team Fund. And so that the bank is a private company, and we look for a vendor to help us create an operational workflow that would be seamless for us. And so they are the vendor of choice. They are part of Foundations of the Carolinas. And so I don't know that they have to be part of a nonprofit for that to happen. I'll defer to Holly on that. But we looked at several vendors who provide this type of service, and E4E was kind of the premier organization that stood out the best in providing a relief fund for employees. And so ours is internal. I know there are other companies that are larger that provide, vendors are allowed to make investments into or contributions into a One Team or to a relief fund for employees. We don't provide that. We just really restrict ours to our employee base. And then, of course, we provide additional funding from the foundation as part of those campaign challenges or matches. So ours is a little more restrictive in what we do. It is for employees only to utilize, and we don't open it up to any of our other vendors as part of this process.
So just to clarify one thing, all of these programs are actually funds, component funds within the charitable organization that we run. So they're not independent entities that we're setting up. They're just simply funds. And those funds are doing the intake. They have an independent accounting within them. Think of them as just like a bank account, so that the account has its own fund accounting associated with it, but it's not a separate entity.
Juan has an interesting question. He's with the Washington State Healthcare Authority, and it's a question for Holly. Sounds like this model and concept applies to private sector and nonprofits. Are there models and approaches for government entities that are doing this? Being able to fund this with government funds is probably prohibited, so I'm wondering if there have been creative ways to do this.
It's a great question, and actually, one of the things that gave me great comfort early on in this work was finding out that the federal government actually has relief programs established for almost every arm of the federal government and all 4 branches of the military. So that was an indicator like, yes, this is good. So absolutely, these programs, same exact infrastructure that we've created for corporate America could be used in a government context. The reason that they are harder to create in a government context is because the funding mechanisms just aren't there. In the federal context, all of those grants are actually loans. Every single independent one is a loan to the employee that is monitored, and they're able to sort of garnish wages if it's not paid back because it's the federal government. The branches of the military are very successful in their fundraising efforts from vendors. And so the vendors are providing dollars into those charitable entities, and they're able to actually make grants in the military. But that tells me right there that we're in good shape offering it to government employees. It's just a matter of finding the funding.
We have a couple of others that I think we have touched on. Lynette, this is actually a question from another person named Lynette. And I think you actually already answered this. If an employee, spouse, or partner experiences a job loss, does that typically qualify for support? I think you had said that it does.
Yes, it does.
Okay. And then
it has an income overlay. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that there's an income and resource test associated with personal financial hardships. And what that means is that if you are a high income earner, you're probably not going to qualify for that distribution. But if you are a person making within X% of the federal poverty guideline, or you're within a certain average median income within various geographic areas, you will qualify.
And on a similar related note, Lauren says, some of our employees live in areas that have been damaged by riots and lost resources and access to local markets for food, and are using their income to manage through COVID. We are a nonprofit. How can we offer access to these grants?
I would say, you can absolutely offer these types of grants. You can, and it's a matter of finding the right funder to create the opportunity for them. One of the things that we've seen, I think you've seen this in COVID around the country, is there have been some specific COVID created funds for general populations of people. In other words, they're not employee populations, but they are associated with some other class. So it's very doable. It's just a matter of finding the funding and getting the infrastructure set up to do it. But there are a lot of nonprofits thinking about this and looking into it right now, I think.
Kathleen says she may have missed this, and I believe that Lynette answered part of this. Do you typically pay the employee directly, or is that the exception during times of extreme disaster? And Lynette, you had said something about the employees getting checks within 5 days. So can you just detail?
Yeah, I gave the example that happened in 5 days. So E4E is the vendor that moderates the process. So if it meets all of the requirements from a regulatory standpoint and some of the other things that Holly indicated around the rubrics, we try to be rapidly responding to employees, particularly in time of COVID, because we know the need is critical and it's immediate. And so E4E has been really fantastic as the third party source to manage that for us. And the example I gave of the employee that needed her mortgage payment because her partner had gotten furloughed, that got paid out within 5 business days once she made application. So again, I'm sure the timing varies depending on, is everything in place that's needed to make the assessment that E4E would apply to the application coming in. But I have heard no complaints about employees not getting that benefit. Yes, they get it directly to them.
Yeah, I think the other aspect to that question may have been, are we paying vendors directly or are we paying individuals? And so I'll say we have done both. We're back to that balance of quality and efficiency on that. And it is not efficient to pay vendors in any form or fashion, but it might be the right thing to do in certain circumstances. It also, if you're talking about $500, $1,000, these relief program grants, typically they're not large amounts of money. They're not $20,000. Many of them are not even 10. Our average grant size is around $2,000. So, having the ability to use digital disbursement, which is what we use, is a fantastic mechanism to speedily offer this in a mechanism where you have thousands upon thousands of applications, but you're trying to do it in a, meeting the criteria that you're trying to meet. So I hope that answers her question, but.
Speaking of timing, what is the estimated timeline for implementation of the program for a company with approximately 350 employees? That one is from Martha.
Our normal turnaround time, I mean, my answer to that would be it's entirely dependent upon the company, on what process they layer on, their contracting process, how many people are involved, is procurement involved, are there assessments, et cetera. For a 350 person firm, I'm guessing it could be done in 2 weeks or less. So I'm generalizing there, but for smaller firms, we're typically not getting into the same types of things that we might be getting into with a large bank, for example. Right? So normal time frame for us in non-COVID period was 6 to 8 weeks for a large company. Short end of the stick on that would be 1 to 2 weeks for a small company. And in COVID, we've been doing it in some instances 5 days or less.
Another one that we have touched on before, but I think it bears repeating and clarifying. Beth wanted to know, do you find that most companies fund EIFs with employee donation primarily? And so Lynette, I know that you were talking about employee donation, but can you just kind of reiterate the scope?
Yeah, I would say that for certain companies, they allow only employee donations with support from the company. And other companies also allow some of their third-party vendors to provide input into that fund. And so they provide, they have other requirements and guidelines around that. I know for our financial institution, employees are the ones actually donating to the fund, but I think it's a large variation depending on the company. As Holly said, it's what you want to create as part of the fund and the guidelines you want to institute and what's your mission that you want to do to support employees. So it varies for sure.
For us, you know, an entirely employee donated program, that would not happen. It would be, you know, the best run, most emphasized fundraising programs might get you to 60 or 70% of funding in a non-major disaster year. And so if you run, you know, the best fundraising campaign, you can get maybe up to 60, 70% of your fund allocated. But in a high disaster year or a situation like this, of course, where people have less to give, you know, you find that the company itself is looking into its own deep pockets or, you know, to try to find resources to allocate.
This, both Megan and Michael asking again what the income requirements are, income overlay and threshold amount. And Megan's in particular is the income requirement re a spouse partner job loss part of the IRS code, or does the entity hosting the EAF set those limitations?
The entity hosting does not set those limitations. It is done by the charity who makes the decision around the rubric and how to apply the IRS regs to each individual situation. The IRS does require an application from every single applicant. So every grant has to be associated with an application, and that application has to demonstrate need. And need can be demonstrated in a variety of ways. Obviously, if it's a catastrophic disaster, that's going to be different than a financial hardship. But our rubric associated with that income piece has been developed over many, many years and has kind of adjusted over time. I would say that it's what we consider to be kind of part of our secret sauce as to how we articulate that and apply it to each individual application. But it's pretty clearly laid out when it applies in 3833, which is the disaster pub that demonstrates how income should be used in these applications.
Well, that's all the time we have to take care of these questions. I want to thank Lynette and Holly both for joining me for an interesting and enlightening discussion. Every day is a school day, as I love to say, and I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Lydia, and to our speakers, Holly and Lynette. That was a great conversation. It seems like these employee relief funds were made for the moment, even though they've been years in development. Thank you again to E4E Relief and to all of you for participating today. If you'd like to join us for more virtual events, you can head to our website, fromday1.co, and check out more of our upcoming webinars. Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Thank you for joining. This is From Day One. and that has been Building an Effective, Compassionate Employee Relief Program. Please join us next week when we have 2 webinars coming up on both Tuesday and Thursday. On Tuesday, we have Reinventing Traditional Internships for a Virtual World. And on Thursday, Nurturing Employee Engagement in Uncertain Times. Thanks again.